My topic is something which is surprisingly hardly ever touched in contemporary Ukrainian studies in the field of political science, which is very different from the case of contemporary studies of Russia. And that is the question of the interlinkage between corruption, and particular organized crime, and Ukrainian politics. This is surprising because Ukraine has had a stable shadow economy of something in the region of 50% of GDP, which means in the city of Kiev it's probably as high as even 70%. And also surprising because Ukraine is ranked by Transparency International as the most corrupt country in Europe. And we have known for a long time that certain political forces have long established ties to criminality and to corruption. Nevertheless, we have ignored in the field of contemporary Ukrainian studies this whole question of these links, in particular between organized crime and Ukrainian political parties. This is even more important today to study because of what happened on the Euromaidan, when over 100 participants were shot down by police or security force snipers, and also because of the very quick and rapid escalation into violence which has taken place in Donetsk and Luhansk, where we have today anything in the region of between, depending on who you quote, 10 to 20,000 insurgents. A figure that high is no longer simply terrorists, which would be in the hundreds. And so that propensity for violence, that linkage to crime and corruption is an element of post-Soviet Ukraine. It's also an element of Ukrainian political forces, particularly in eastern Ukraine. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us to not ignore this topic when we are looking at the subject of Ukrainian political parties, and inevitably, because of the close association between politics and business in Ukraine, that overflows into economics, business, oligarchs, and such like. The reason why this has become such a hot topic is because, of course, the party regions became, in the course of the last decade, the only political machine in Ukraine. It destroyed the monopoly of politics that we had in eastern and southern Ukraine in the 1990s under President Kuchma. It created a monopoly of power, making the Communist Party its satellite. And the party region's two main bases of support were the Donbass and the Crimea. And it's not a coincidence that these two regions of the country were also the most violent in the 1990s during the so-called transition to a market economy. And that violence was part and parcel of the makeup of individuals who entered the party regions, particularly those who survived by the late 1990s and who joined in the period after the Orange Revolution, when relations with the opposition rapidly deteriorated. And we saw this violence not only in threats made during the Orange Revolution, but at the time President Kuchma was able to successfully ward off those threats. There was a separatist Congress then. There were threats to bring in vigilantes from Donetsk. About 30 or 40,000 came to Kiev, but they were not unleashed on the Orange Revolution. But we saw from 2006 onwards antagonistic mass protests in the Crimea and elsewhere, which disrupted NATO Ukraine military exercises. But in particular, violence grew and became quite common in the Ukrainian parliament, where you had individual members of the party regions who had emerged from that criminality of the 1990s and wanted to prove themselves to party regions' leaders. This deteriorated even further by 2009-2010, and of course under Viktor Yanukovych's 4-year rule, it became a standard practice of the regime to resort to so-called titushki, who are vigilantes. You can call them skinheads, in the sense of very low-ranking enforcers for organized crime, usually from the sports world. And these became a matter of course, and they were used extensively both in corporate raiding and in attacks on opposition deputies inside Parliament and outside, and also for the purposes of election fraud. And they were used in particular during the Euromaidan, when you had murders, tortures, abductions, and such like committed by these vigilantes. Now, it's not a coincidence that political forces had emerged from criminality and corruption on a massive scale, and where there were many murders in regions such as Crimea and Donbass, that these same political forces also resorted to violence, also resorted to the use of vigilantes. Opposition groups never did use vigilantes for that purpose. This was a purely product of the Party of Regions and its allies. There's a reason why there was a close nexus emerged between former security forces that had been co-opted by new business groups and by new political leaders in both the Crimea and Donbass. And the new Crimean leader, Mr. Aksyonov, is not surprisingly one of the members of this criminal groupings from the 1990s with the criminal name Goblin. So the Crimea and Donbass became the Party Region's main base of support. It also showed them to what extent these were not very ethnically Ukrainian regions, and so their ideological pretensions were always quite Eastern Slavic, Slavophile, Russophile, and to a great degree Sovietophile, because both regions have a very strong Soviet identity as well. And this made this decade of Ukrainian independence very different from the 1990s, where in eastern Ukraine you had centrist parties who had emerged from the Communist Youth League, the Komsomol, and these were budding liberal middle-class parties, parties created by people such as Viktor Pinchuk, and these were very different, both parties and individuals, to the working class, very violent political forces that emerged from the Donbass. And tragically, we saw this in the Euromaidan. Now, it's incumbent for us to show this because it shows to what degree it's a mythology that West Ukraine is the most xenophobic region of Ukraine. That's completely untrue. Ukrainian nationalist or far-right political forces have never been popular in Ukraine. 2012 was an exception where Svoboda entered the Ukrainian parliament because there was a threat. Many people voted for Svoboda because of the threat of President Yanukovych and the language law. But it's unlikely that that will be repeated again. Whereas the more authoritarian, thuggish, violent political forces that emerged in eastern Ukraine from Party Region and the Communist Party always received a minimum of about 40%, sometimes higher, for presidential elections, and therefore that's at least 4 or more times more than what we saw in Western Ukraine. And also what we've seen since the Russian occupation of the Crimea in March is that the Crimea has confirmed that it's the most xenophobic, racist, intolerant region of Ukraine. Just ask any Crimean Tatars and ask any patriotic Ukrainians. The attacks on patriotic Ukrainians in both the Crimea and by Donetsk separatists has been extremely extensive. So again, these two regions prove that, and it proves what they emerge from, a culture of violence. And that authoritarianism and violence is something which shows to what degree those political forces are different, and to what degree those two regions, Donbass and Crimea, were different from other parts of Ukraine. I don't think it's a coincidence that within the 8 Russian-speaking oblasts of eastern southern Ukraine, it's only the Donbass where you have this violent separatism, which has become a massive insurgency, of course with Russian support, but not only with Russian support, it also has support from the former President Yanukovych, from organized crime figures such as Ivan Yushhenko, and others who were always tied to the party regions. Within the party regions, right up to the very end, you had at least 18 organized crime leaders, according to Hennady Moskal, head of the Parliamentary Committee on Organized Crime and Corruption, and these provided some of the resources for the violent separatists in Donetsk. So we need to bring in the question of crime, criminality, shadow economy, large-scale, the background of murders and killings, to give us a better understanding of the authoritarian political culture that has led to the emergence of the party regions and Crimean nationalist political forces, and also to what degree this led to the manner in which the Yanukovych administration ruled Ukraine. At times it seemed like a foreign occupation army was in place in Kiev, raping and pillaging the country, according to the General Prosecutor's Office. During the 4 years of Yanukovych's rule, something in the region of $100 billion was stolen from Ukraine, and the accompanying violence, because Viktor Yanukovych and his team and his family never expected to leave office. They had come to power for life. Of course, this doesn't represent all of Eastern Ukraine. There were more liberal political forces and even patriotic forces around in the 1990s, and this maybe now will re-emerge with the collapse of the party regions and maybe the banning of the Communist Party. We certainly see this with Jewish Ukraine oligarch Igor Kolomoisky in Dnipropetrovsk, the city I visited in May of this year, and also in places like Kharkiv and even Odessa. So we shouldn't assume that the criminality and politics of the party regions and Crimean Russian nationalists is representative of all of Russian-speaking Ukraine. But they certainly left their mark on the second decade of Ukrainian independence, and until Ukraine drastically reduces the size of the shadow economy from half or more of GDP and reduces the amount of the billions which is sent offshore each year to offshore bank accounts, and destroys the linkage between business and politics, these links between crime, criminality, corruption, shadow economy, offshore zones, and politics will inevitably remain in Ukraine. So it's a lot of work for the existing president, newly elected President Poroshenko, but a big step in that direction is the downfall of the party regions, which I don't believe can come back to power now. Thank you.